few years ago before COVID, I was working with a high school leadership team, and they had a challenge where they were focusing on tardiness and absenteeism among their students, something a lot of schools deal with. And every time I mentioned a strategy that might work, or one that I've seen work in high schools that were even more complicated than the one I was in, the principal would always come back and say, "We tried that, we're doing that, we're doing that." Now, the principal was the only one who spoke. During the meeting, the principal took a phone call, and I was left with the rest of the leadership team. And one of the assistant principals looked at me and said, "Everything that the principal said we're doing, we're actually not doing." That's a lack of collective leader efficacy, and it happens a lot. Now, collective leader efficacy is a shared conviction that when a leadership team comes together, like an instructional leadership team, they can have an enormous impact and a very deep impact on student learning. And in this video, I'm going to talk about 8 drivers that contribute to developing collective leader efficacy when it comes to those instructional leadership teams. Now, first and foremost, if you like this video, at the end, please give it a like. And if you want to subscribe to the channel, I have plenty of other videos on here about leadership and teaching. Now, back to collective leader efficacy. It's a shared conviction among our leadership team that we can have an impact, a deep impact on student learning. And we know that by now, there are a lot of different types of efficacy. There's self-efficacy, which is confidence we have in our own actions, which is actually context specific. We don't all have the same strengths and weaknesses. That's something we know. There's collective teacher efficacy, which is a shared conviction that teachers can come together and have an impact on student learning. But what makes collective leader efficacy a little bit different is that a principal or a school leader on the team typically has status over the rest of the team, just like in my example before at the beginning of the video. And what we have to consider when we're looking at collective leader efficacy and when our instructional leadership team comes together is that if we don't set up a place where people around the table have a voice, then why are they even sitting there? That's going to be frustrating. And the reality is, we know that there's been an increase in anxiety and stress among teachers and leaders since during the pandemic and certainly in these months that have followed. As a leader, what we always have to think about is if we go into a meeting with one idea and we walk out with the same one, that's control. But if we walk into a meeting with one idea and walk out with a better one, that's collaboration. And what I started to look at beyond the why, because we know why is important. We've heard Simon Sinek talk about it. We've read his books. And the why is totally important. But how we come together is important too. Because too often we make an assumption that people know how to come together as a team, and we don't think about those issues of status and the things that go around the table. And if we really want to get the most out of our people, and we really want to elevate their leadership and their skills, and also have some reciprocal learning where we learn at the same time, we have to understand how to come together, and then we can develop that why to a much deeper level. You know, Ken Leithwood out of Ontario has talked a lot about how do you motivate people. And this research has been around for years. In order to motivate people, they need to develop a sense of agency. In order to do that, there were 2 things at play: capacity beliefs and context beliefs. Capacity beliefs is our self-efficacy. Do we have the confidence to do the work? And like I said, it's context specific. So there are areas that we have to grow, right? And that's where we learn. That's why a leadership team is so important. We can learn from people around the table. But on the other side of that is context beliefs. Do we actually think we work in a school system that's going to support us when we're trying to be innovative? There's a lot of research that actually says no. In fact, the Edweek Research Center has shown that about 86% of principals that were surveyed in one of their surveys said that they completely support teachers when they're trying to be innovative. The problem is only about 46 to 47% of teachers in the survey completely agree that the principal supports them when they're trying to be innovative. So this instructional leadership space is something that's really important because there's a lot going on, right? There's the academic and there's the social emotional. We know that people are anxious, and we know that there's a teacher shortage. We know that people are leaving the profession. So even in a space like the instructional leadership team, that's a place where we can actually create a sense of belonging. And what we know from research by people like Johann Hari that show that in order for people to feel connected, and which will help them with their anxiety and stress, they need to feel a sense of belonging. We can do that in our instructional leadership team. Now, what I promised you is that I'd focus on 8 drivers, and I'm going to do it here because you'll notice that the language of drivers actually comes from Michael Fullan. And Michael has some pretty specific criteria when it comes to developing drivers. Number 1 is that it must foster intrinsic motivation on the part of teachers and even students, right? And it must engage students and teachers in continuous learning. And that's something that we've talked about a lot, right, over the years, is that this whole idea of continuous learning, continuous improvement. What Michael's also saying is that it must inspire collective work or teamwork. And then last but not least, it needs to impact 100% of teachers and students. And I know that sounds like a big get, but the reality is, even as a school principal, when I had a leadership team, I made sure that everything was interconnected. We had our principal's advisory council. There was one grade level representative and special area representative on the team. They had to go back during one of their common planning times to talk to the rest of their team about what we focused on as a principal's advisory council. They got all the notes. Everybody in the school got the notes. And then we talked about it at our staff meetings. So when you can have that continuous cycle, that's something that can happen, and it can help impact our teachers and certainly our students 100%. So it's a worthy goal. Now, out of the drivers, there are a few that have been well established by people like Ken Leithwick, but there are other ones that I'm introducing into the dialogue as well. And it's important to say that these drivers are connected to the criteria of Michael Fullan and also some criteria from Banderas that I'll sort of bookend this video with. Now, number 1 would be mindset. And mindset's an important one. We always think Carol Dweck, right, when we think mindset. But even Ryan Smith from the 1990s said it's a predisposition in the way that we see the world. And when I think about mindset these days, I think about, do we have a growth mindset or do we have a deficit mindset? Do we think everything is COVID learning loss? Do we actually feel like our leadership team, do we have the mindset that our leadership team is a respectful place where we can engage in learning and challenge each other's thinking? Do we have a collective mindset where we can come together collectively? Because like in that example at the beginning, the people around the table, in fact, one person around the table, when I asked them, why are you a part of this team? What is your role here? They said, I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing on the team, and I've been on it for 2 years. So mindset is also about how do we develop that collective mindset that we all contribute to the greater good. That's something that's really important, especially when it comes to what we know about anxiety and stress. Now, speaking of anxiety and stress, the second of the drivers is that of well-being. This is another one that I've introduced into the vocabulary, and I used it in my book, Collective Leader Efficacy, Strengthening Instructional Leadership Teams. Got my books a little bit messed up there. But the second driver is that of well-being. And well-being is more than just, hey, we have to teach teachers how to breathe. It's about looking at our workload. It's about looking at our boundaries. It's about setting up boundaries around emails or even boundaries around how we talk to one another. That's something that's really important. Now, the third driver is that of professional learning and development. And I'm introducing this into the vocabulary when it comes to collective leader efficacy, and I certainly did this in the book, and I broke it down quite a bit. But one of the quotations, or at least the pieces of research around professional learning and development that I love the most, is that of Andy Hargreaves and Michael Fullan. They wrote about it a few years ago for Learning Forward. And what they said is professional learning is a lot like student learning, where we talk about outcomes. At the beginning of all of my meetings, whether I'm running a workshop or I'm coaching, I always start with success criteria. How are we going to know during this time, if we're going to be together for an hour or 90 minutes, we were successful? I have a video on that on my YouTube channel as well. But when you develop success criteria, after you say, how will we know we were successful, we can say what evidence could we collect to understand our success. So that's a lot like professional learning. It's also where we learn together. We can, if we're talking about different strategies on how to engage students, then that is professional learning, because we're talking about strategies and we've got to talk about outcomes. The other side of that is professional development. And Andy and Michael actually talk about the fact that professional development is where you develop mindfulness and team building. That's why, too, at the beginning when I said that about mindset, is your space a place where you feel like you can collectively come together? Now, the fourth driver is that of workload, or working conditions. So working conditions is actually where we talk about, like, what are the benefits of being here? That could be pay scale, which we know is really important. And another reason why we have a teacher shortage is because teachers are leaving the profession due to low pay. But there are other things there too, like workload. In the book, I talk about de-implementation, yet another video I have on the channel. And de-implementation is the abandonment of low-value practices. We have to get a grip on our workload. That's also why when our leadership team comes together and we create an adaptive challenge, that comes from the language of Jenny Donahue and Stephen Katz. When we develop an adaptive challenge, the thing that our team just can't figure out, and that's where we want to put our focus, it's really important when we talk about working conditions and that of workload to make sure that we're staying focused on this one adaptive challenge as opposed to going around and trying to do about 10. Now, the fifth of the drivers is that of organizational commitment. Organizational commitment is actually a long-standing driver, and Ken Leithwood was the one who introduced this many years ago. Organizational commitment means, what is our organization committed to? When I work with school leadership teams, I've actually said to superintendents and some school leadership teams, I don't understand the identity of your school. Like, I will look at your I don't understand the identity of your school. And that's kind of hard for people to hear. And one of the things that I see schools doing is they start doing empathy interviews with their students, right? Where they start to ask what the barriers are to learning. But another thing is they start to look at things like learning dispositions or portrait of a graduate. What do we want graduates to look like when they leave us? That's an organizational commitment that's focused on learning and focused on maximizing student growth and student achievement. But I wanted to add to the organizational commitment, because organizational commitment also means, to me, is the organization committed to us? If we know that stress and anxiety is real, and it's a real issue, if we know that teacher shortage is growing and growing, and we think about all the research that shows us that we need a place where we feel connected, not just a place we work. Because if we go into work every day thinking it's just a place we work and our voices don't matter, we're going to be more disgruntled, or we're certainly not going to put a lot of our emphasis into our jobs. But if we come to a place that we know actually cares about us, that to me means that we're going to be much more connected and probably a little bit happier. But also, when we know we have a voice in the process, that's going to help us stay even more connected, and that's going to impact students for the best too. So organizational commitment isn't just what our organization is committed to when it comes to student learning. It's also about how our organization is committed to us. And the other part of that is are we committed to our organization? Because, it's really easy to be committed to an organization when they do things we like. It's a lot more difficult to be committed to an organization when they do things that we don't necessarily agree with. So organizational commitment is a huge one. Now, the sixth one is that of context beliefs. And I actually talked about this a little bit before because of Ken Leithwood's work. Context beliefs is simply, do I work in a place, or do I know or think that I work in a place that's going to support me when I'm trying to be innovative? This is often when I'm working with teams, and I wrote about this in Collective Leader Efficacy as well, but this is when I'm working with teams, when I start to talk about, do we have a common understanding of what support actually means and looks like? Because sometimes we'll say we're not being supported, but we never really talk about what that support is supposed to look like. So context beliefs is a lot like that. Do we actually work in a school that's going to support us when we're trying to be innovative? Now, the second to last one is the skills to work in collectives. And this is something I worked on with John Hattie. John was introducing it because of collective student efficacy, how students come together. And he told me about the skills to work in collectives. But what I wanted to do is explore it in a different way. And to me, the skills to work in collectives is to understand what's the emotional intelligence of our team. How do we communicate with one another? What about social sensitivity? Do we understand how people actually receive our message? Or do we understand that we need to differentiate our communication to people because sometimes we might have a staff member that is okay with you being blunt, and other times we need more of the kid glove approach. So the skills to work in collectives is that. It's about understanding those nuances in a way that we communicate, but also our emotional intelligence. And the last one is actually the bookend that I said that I would give you from Banderas research. In order for these drivers to be considered drivers, I had to go into the confidence to work in collectives. That's another one that John and I were talking about. And when it comes to the confidence to work in collectives, the criteria there is actually set up from Bandera from the 1970s. And if you don't know Albert Bandera's work, he's like the godfather of efficacy. And what he found is that they're ranked in order of importance too. When we're looking at developing somebody's confidence, we have to think of mastery experiences. Do we actually go through a challenging activity and come out successful on the other side? Because when we engage in a mastery experience like COVID and we come out successful on the other side, that actually increases our efficacy quite a bit. He also talks about vicarious learning, vicarious experiences. We learn from one another. So one of the reasons why I wanted professional learning and development to be a part of the collective leader efficacy research is that if we know that a vicarious experience is when we learn from one another, then that should be something that we're doing when we're actually working together as a team, using those strategies, modeling those strategies on our team that we want to see in the classroom. The third one that we're looking at is that of verbal persuasion, how we actually talk to one another, the feedback we give. And the last one is that of affective states. And what the research shows is affective states are important because anxiety actually diminishes efficacy and excitement increases efficacy. And that's why you can see that I talked about things like mindset and well-being. So those are the 8 drivers. And you can certainly look deeper into the book, but those are the 8 drivers that are the how of how a team should come together, and those things that we need to be able to think about, those nuances we need to also focus on, because you can't just jump into the work if you haven't done that team building stuff. And the 8 drivers are what helps do that. Thank you so much for watching. Once again, if you liked the video, give it a like, and please consider subscribing to the channel. I have other educational videos on here, but thank you very much for your time.